chemistry.
Hello and welcome back to Brought to You by Chemistry, with me, Dr. Alex Lathbridge. This series, we're taking a deep dive into the science of air quality, and today we're going indoors. Why is indoor air quality so important? Should we be worried about household appliances? And how can we improve the quality of air inside our homes, offices, and public buildings? To find out this and more, time to bring in our experts.
Hi, I'm Cath Noakes. I'm a Professor of Environmental Engineering for Buildings at the University of Leeds.
Ooh, very nice. Very quick, very snippy.
Hello, I'm Nick Carslaw. I'm a Professor of Indoor Air Chemistry at the University of York.
Wonderful. Okay, great. So Cath and Nick. Great, easy breezy. Single syllables. I love them. So I am, of course, going to start with what might be a silly question for both of you, but how is indoor air different from outside air?
That's a really hard question to generalize, I think, because it really does depend on the environment. So I think indoors there are numerous sources of pollution. So there are lots of activities we do indoors that can produce pollutants. So things like cooking and cleaning. A lot of the pollutants that we generate indoors are the same as the ones that we find outdoors, like nitrogen oxides if you cook with gas. Volatile organic compounds come from lots of things we use indoors, like cleaning products, and also particulate matter. So if you burn your bacon when you're making a bacon butter, you make particulate matter. So we also have particulate matter emitted by vehicles outdoors. So there are many similarities between pollutants indoors and outdoors. But I guess the big difference is that we spend 90% of our time indoors, and probably all of the attention around air quality is 90% on outdoors. So at the moment, there's a lot of people just think we have the balance wrong, and we need to focus more on the microenvironments where we spend most of our time, which is in buildings, whether that's at home or offices or commuting between them in a car, for instance.
I think I would add to that a bit as well. I mean, I totally agree with Nick that we need to focus more on indoors, but indoors is so variable between different places as well. So if you went outdoors on your street, the outdoor air pollution that you're exposed to is pretty similar to what your next door neighbour's exposed to. But indoors could be totally different, because what they do in their house versus what you do in your house is completely different. And even within your house, what you experience in your kitchen versus what you experience in your bedroom might be totally different. So really understanding those different sources in different places and how we get exposed to them in different places is quite a challenge.
You're exposed to volatile organic compounds, nitrogen oxides, particulates. But I don't know, maybe this is someone who doesn't know a lot about air quality, but I would say that, the particulates you're exposed to if you burn bacon, wouldn't they be different from the particulates you're exposed to from cars, right?
Yeah, that's a really good observation. And this is something that we need a lot more research on. So at the moment, if you look at the advice from COMEP, which is the government's committee on the medical effects of air pollution, they think about these issues a lot. So they look really carefully at all the evidence around air pollution and illness. And, it's really hard to try and find the specific links that say this pollutant causes this health effect. And with particulate matter at the moment, we know that different sources produce different types of particles, and that's probably size and composition. So we did some work a few years ago looking at the London Underground, and the particles on the London Underground are very different composition to the ones that you get from cars. And you're right that the particles that you get from cooking your bacon are very different to the ones we get from cars as well. But the problem is it's really hard to do the studies where you just have a particular type of particle and look at the health effects of those particles. So there's a bit of work being done on this now in Manchester, actually by Gordon McFiggins and his group, trying to look at the toxicity associated with particles from different sources. But at the moment, we really don't understand the differential effects. And that's an important question, I think, that we need to understand.
Okay, so that's really fascinating, because what I've wondered is how different do molecules act compared outdoors compared to indoors? Like if you have, you know, volatile organic compounds outside, as soon as they get inside, do they, you know, act differently? Do they take their little molecular shoes off and something? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, they do. There's a few things that change actually. So one of the things that changes is that we have less sunlight indoors, which is obvious when you think about it. But so outdoors, a lot of the chemistry in the atmosphere is driven by photolysis or sunlight. But indoors, we have far less light. So we have some light that comes through windows. We have some light from internal lighting, but it's not as strong as sunlight outdoors. So we do still get photolysis reactions, which is where sunlight breaks bonds, but they're much slower. So that anything that's connected with light, any reactions connected with light are much slower indoors. And the other thing that's really different about indoors is that we have much more surface area. So basically things like ozone is quite sticky. And when it comes in through windows, it sticks to things like carpets and furniture, which means that ozone concentrations are actually much lower indoors than outdoors. So there are definitely quite big differences in the chemistry between indoors and outdoors.
Okay. And so, like, I guess outdoors, you've got things like cars, vehicles, you know, people moving, people walking, all that. But indoors, things are a bit more stationary. You know, my kitchen, like my oven, isn't getting up and walking around. So does that change things, the difference between having stationary things in your indoor environment versus mobile things in the outdoor environments? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. You're probably getting more into the realms of physics, which is probably more Cath's thing, but it's I guess you get piston effects that pull pollution along roads. I'm not
Yeah,
quite
sure. You do to some extent, but it kind of depends. And even though things move outdoors, like cars, they often move in very well-defined ways. So, you know, and particularly where you've got like a busy road and you've got a lot of vehicles traveling along it, you can almost treat that as a continuous source of pollution, rather than a sort of distinct moving source. But there are differences, and of course the weather. Well, the weather affects both outdoors and indoors. So we get some of our pollution, particularly in certain places in the UK, like in London, where that pollution some of that gets brought in by certain weather conditions. But then also weather affects indoors as well, because we change our behaviours. We shut windows and things when it's raining or when it's cold, and we do things, you know, we open up the windows when it's sunny. So there are a bunch of other factors in there which affect this.
I never thought the British love for talking about the weather would take me here. would take me to thinking about how it affects my health. But speaking on that, like, do we have any data or is there research being done on how indoor air quality impacts, you know, health versus outdoor air quality?
Yes, but it's hard. I think so. There's some things we've got really good data for. So things like carbon monoxide, we know about radon, we know the health effects of smoking, which is often an indoor activity. And then we've got some things around ventilation, and ventilation is not quite the same as air quality, but it's very strongly related. But we know that poorly ventilated buildings, people perform less well, they sleep less well, they're less satisfied. And we know that it relates to things like transmission of infection. We know from data before the pandemic that schools which had lower ventilation rates in the USA had higher illness absences. But as Nick sort of said earlier, for lots of other contaminants, it's really hard to separate out some of those health effects because we're exposed to lots of different types of pollutants, either all at the same time or sequentially during our day. And knowing which ones are harmful and which ones, you know, maybe don't really matter that much is very, very challenging to separate out. And I think there are associations between, you know, certain things in indoor environments and, for example, asthma, but it's much harder to work out those associations compared to outdoor air quality. And a lot of that is to do with the data that we've got. We've got far more data on outdoor air than we have on indoor air.
I think to add to that, we just finished a big European network study with about 200 scientists from around Europe. And one of the things we did in that was to try and compile all of the measurements of indoor air pollutants that have been made to date. And we found about 800 different chemicals have been measured indoors from different studies at different times. If you were going to do the health studies properly, you'd need to take each of those 800 chemicals and expose human cells or some sort of assay, I guess, biological assay, to that particular pollutant and look at the effects. So to do that would take an enormous amount of time and money. It's just a massive undertaking. So I guess what the key thing is to try and think about which of those pollutants are going to occur often in our homes, and out of those, which are the ones that we need to worry about. And I think that's what a number of studies are trying to do at the moment. We're trying to narrow down that list so we can then do focused health studies. So there are some chemicals like formaldehyde, for instance, that we already know is ubiquitous in homes. It comes from wooden products. It's made through chemistry. So there are a few chemicals, I think, where we have a fairly good understanding that they might cause us harm.
So on that, like, what would you say are some of the biggest contributors to poor indoor air quality? You know, is it things like formaldehyde?
Well, again, it's hard to generalize, but formaldehyde does come up quite often when we're looking at modeling studies. The problem with formaldehyde is it's actually quite hard to measure. It's a really challenging molecule. So we've been looking at this at York, and it's just because of its properties. It's small, it's polar. It's actually quite hard to find a technique where you can measure it accurately, and that's still a focus, I would say. So I think it's all down to trying to understand which of these chemicals we should focus on, and then talking to sensor manufacturers, like I was yesterday, for instance, about the need for developing sensors for specific chemicals so we can get a better idea of how abundant these chemicals are in our homes.
I think even though we don't know that much yet about the specific chemicals and how we get exposed to them and when, and how to measure them, I think we do know quite a lot about the sources for indoor air. So obviously outdoor air is a source because it's not completely disconnected. It comes into your building. I guess probably the biggest sources we've got in indoors are people, or associated with people. So there are lots of things we do, cooking, personal care products, cleaning, smoking, candles, all sorts of those things, which we result in air pollution. And obviously some of those things we're not going to stop doing. We're not going to not cook, or, and we're not going to stop having showering and things. But those actions are associated with air pollution. There are also sources in buildings. So, for example, certain paints and building materials can release volatile organic compounds. If you've got a building that's prone to damp, then you might get mold, and that releases spores in the air. And then I think the other one we've not talked about yet, but wood burners and stoves and things, which are a huge culprit. And of course, if you've got a stove in your living room, it releases some things into your home, but an awful lot of that goes up the chimney out and then goes into your next door neighbour's home. So there's I think that's a huge source, and probably quite hazardous pollutants. Although, as Nick said, we still need to know a lot more about the specific chemicals and how they affect us.
So here's a question for both of you then. What would the perfect experiment look like to push forward your work? Would we have to go through all of these 800 different molecules one by one to get an answer on, how much we see them and what their effects are on health?
Just before Christmas, we got funding to build an indoor air testing facility on campus. And what we're going to do in that, we're going to have like a semi-detached house with an integrated laboratory in between. So the two sides of the house will be very different in terms of ventilation. So one side's going to be passive house standard. One side's going to be more typical British building regulations at the moment, standard build. The passive house side is going to be very thermally efficient, very well regulated with mechanical heat recovery. So basically we're kind of looking at, this is what the future could be for energy efficiency, when we worry about climate change versus what we have now. And then in the middle of the houses, we have an integrated laboratory where we'll have lots of very high research grade instrumentation. So we'll be monitoring the air quality in both sides of the house. So we'll be looking at what happens after the build as the emissions from the building materials are off-gassed. Then we'll have a period where we decorate the house and furnish it, and then we'll look again at the emissions from that. And then we'll start doing activities where we're cooking and cleaning. So we'll be able to kind of separate the different components of a house, the building materials, the furnishings, the activities by people, and look at that for 2 different types of ventilation. So I think that will help us answer a lot of the questions about what the sources of pollutants are, what the most important sources are, what the key chemicals are from all of these activities. So I think that's something we're quite excited about.
Cath, what about you? What would the perfect experiment be?
Again, it's a really hard question because I mean, almost the perfect experiment is so big that you couldn't possibly ever do it. But I think I would want to complement what Nick's doing and actually collect lots of data from lots and lots of different buildings to understand that variability, because we really lack that. We don't understand how air quality varies across lots of different environments. There's a number of studies of looking at homes, and some of those measure with static sensors in homes. Some of them have personal sensors that people carry. But there's lots and lots of places that we don't know much about. We don't know much about people's workplaces. We don't know much about schools. We don't know much about hospitals. We don't know much about the social places we go. So I would love to see data collection, probably starting with baseline parameters like ventilation, temperature, humidity, but then expanding that to add in particulates, and then over time adding in chemicals and things, but also trying to understand what people do in those environments.
Okay, with that in mind, what can our listeners do to improve our indoor air quality? Like, is it a case of getting rid of, if you have a gas stove, trying to get rid of that, or if you're for some reason you have a fireplace or a wood burner, getting rid of that? Like, what can one do to have better indoor air quality without making silly changes, getting ready a shower or something?
I mean, we're probably going to say the same thing. So I think there are some simple things that everyone can do, and that's around ventilation. So for instance, when you cook, I think there's some statistic like 75% of people don't use their cooker hoods when they are cooking. So a very simple intervention would be when you cook to put on your cooker hood. Make sure you're extracting away the fumes. If you haven't got a cooker hood, you can open the window while you're cooking and for up to 10 minutes afterwards, and that will get rid of the pollutants you generate. You can do things like using the back rings on your cooker hob instead of the front rings, because we know that the cooker hoods are more effective at the back. You can switch from frying and meat to boiling vegetables, for instance. So we know that frying emits more particles than boiling or steaming, and we know that cooking meat emits more particles than cooking vegetables. When you're cleaning, you can ventilate again. Always follow the manufacturer's instructions. There are a lot of people who use too much cleaning product and probably clean too often. So I'm really delighted that my research tells me that I shouldn't clean too often. It's one of the best results ever. So I think a key thing is moderation and ventilation. So don't use any products indoors. Don't have 20 scented candles burning. One every now and again is fine. And if you do have something that's generating pollutants indoors, then make sure you ventilate.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think there's lots and lots of little things that people can do. Even simple things like if you use a spray deodorant, use a roll-on deodorant. You're just putting less stuff into the air for you to breathe in. It's not changing your personal hygiene particularly. And ventilation, again, is quite important. It's lots of people think, oh, I must seal everything up, must make my house really energy efficient. But we need ventilation. We need it for our health. We need it for our well-being. And so actually thinking about, well, how does air get into my house, and how can I make sure that I ventilate, particularly when I'm, doing things that might generate contaminants and things. And then, of course, you mentioned about gas stoves and things like that. Switching out your gas stove and replacing a boiler with, say, for a heat pump, both of those really help from a climate and an air quality perspective, but they are a much higher cost thing. So for many people, they're on people's agenda, and they are a good thing to do, but they are a higher cost approach.
You've given me a lot to think about there, but I particularly take umbrage with, sorry, I'm not allowed to cook meat. I have to boil vegetables. Do you know how depressing that is? What? No, why?
Well, I can say this is a smug vegetarian, you see, so it's fine. But I don't think, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because if you look at a lot of, if you unwrap that, we're saying that frying less, eating less meat, all these things work in the right direction for lots of things. So it's probably better for our health. It's definitely better for the climate to eat less meat. And it's certainly better for indoor air quality. So I'm not suggesting that people stop eating meat. It's more, you know, could you maybe put that meat in the oven instead of frying it on the hob? You'd make a difference to what you generate. Or could you eat meat less often? Or if you do eat meat, then just make sure you ventilate. It's not saying you can't eat meat. It's just thinking about doing it and then being active about removing the pollutants that you generate.
Yeah, and avoid burning your toast as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, toast is lovely. We all love toast, but burnt toast is just bad.
Has the pandemic really changed how people think about indoor air quality? Like, you know, are things going to get better from now on because we've had something that scared us?
I would love to think so. I mean, the pandemic showed us a lot of things. It particularly focused on ventilation because that was the thing which we knew was related to infection. So it's not quite the same as the air quality, but again, related. It showed us we know very little about it. Most buildings, we don't know how they're ventilated or how well they're ventilated. But we do know that we did figure out that lots and lots of buildings have ventilation rates that don't meet the standards they should do. And lots of people lack both the knowledge and I think the agency to improve air quality. And that's particularly the case in workplaces and public spaces where you're at the mercy of whoever owns that space and operates that space, and you can't change it yourself. But I think, you know, it certainly raised awareness worldwide. It pushed it up with the public, it pushed it up with policymakers. There were some improvements. So things like the building regulations did actually change in 2021 for non-domestic buildings in the UK. And we've seen in the US, there are new standards coming through around ventilation for infection control in buildings. But I do think a lot of it is very short-lived because some of that successes of then suddenly we then got a cost of living crisis. And people just actually close windows, and even worse, close the windows, turn the heating down in buildings. And then that both of those massively worsen the indoor air quality.
Well, I just agree with what Kath's saying. I mean, I've been quite surprised after the pandemic, I guess. So we're part of a project called TAPAS, which is looking at air quality around schools. And again, I've just been quite surprised at the state of some school buildings, and it was really apparent during the pandemic that things like windows having been painted over the years. So, you know, schools and other buildings as well, but I think particularly schools are in quite a tricky situation. They're trying to provide good ventilation for the kids, but they quite often have their hands tied by the age of the buildings and the fact that they're not really fit for purpose anymore. So I think all this stuff's really important, and given that we can't regulate all buildings, or we can't, you know, change the way we look at this for all buildings, maybe schools would be a sensible place to start, in my opinion.
All right, so let's try and be optimistic here. We're sort of trying to move towards perhaps a greener future, you know, and having buildings that are more energy efficient. Like, do you think in that there's room should be made for improving air quality?
Yeah, 100%. It must be. So, I mean, if you have a building, let's say you design a building, it's really low energy, but it's got really poor indoor air, and it's really poor for the health of the occupants. Would you call that a sustainable building? I'm not sure I would. I think for something to be sustainable, it has to actually deliver both on, you know, the climate and energy goals, but also on the goals of the people. So having a healthy building has got to be part of that. And I think there are, you know, thinking about this in terms of future design, you need to think about the locations of buildings, the materials, the systems in buildings, the occupants, thinking about the indoor and the outdoor air quality together. But there are opportunities, I think, you know, and there's such a big push at the moment on net zero, and actions around that, and we need to look for where we've got the win-win. So, for example, we already mentioned gas stoves and heat pumps. Actually, that is a win-win. If you get that right, you've both reduced sources of air pollution and you've decarbonised, and you're reducing the climate impacts as well. But we also need to look at where there's potential conflicts. So one of the conflicts is, not so much insulating your building. Insulating your building is still a really good thing to do. But if you make it too airtight and don't put ventilation in, then you can make your indoor air quality worse. So just making sure that in the guidance and legislation that's there for net zero, that we put ventilation and air quality in that mix, means that we can tackle both at the same time. And if people are already going to be improving buildings for net zero, actually it's really no more effort to tackle the air quality at the same time.
Yeah, I think the other thing to say there is that a lot of the problems with indoor air quality would be solved if our outdoor air quality was improved. So a lot of the problems, if you look at schools in London, for instance, where they're having to use air cleaners, they can't open the windows because they're next to a busy road. If that traffic wasn't there emitting pollutants, they could open their windows. So I think this needs a holistic approach as well. You need to think about the whole system. If we clean up our outdoor air, we can open windows, and then a lot of the problems will go. Not all of them, but a lot of them.
Okay. I mean, I've had a question put through from producer Hiren about air fryers, but we're going to go straight over that because I don't believe in air fryers. If you're going to fry, just fry with your actually commit. So what we like to do with Brought to You by Chemistry is we like to end with something that a listener can take away from this. So Nick, Cath, for both of you, very briefly, what would you want a listener to take away from this episode? We've spoken about indoor air quality. What would you want them to take away? I'm going to start with you, Nick.
I think, like we've already said, just think about the sources of pollution in your home. Try and moderate the use of things that aren't necessary, like air fresheners, scented candles, use them in moderation. If you have to use them, or when you cook or clean, then ventilate. So it's moderation, ventilation.
And I would agree with that. And particularly think about how your home is ventilated and what you can do to make that work best for you. It doesn't mean you have to have all of your windows open all of the time. Opening them periodically, particularly when there's, potentially higher emissions, is a really good place to start.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Brought to You by Chemistry with me, Dr. Alex Lathbridge. Join us next time, where we're going to be taking a look at what government policy can and can't do for our air quality. Yeah, we like to keep it fun. See you next time.